lot of researchers are familiar with a gentleman by the name of George Heilmeyer. Dr. Heilmeyer was the director of DARPA back in the 1970s, and he's probably best known for what's called the Heilmeyer Catechism, which is a list of a number of questions that you can use and that he would ask all of his program managers to try to focus and make sure that they were focused on the right things when they were planning their programs. And I've come to know sort of a reduced set, if you will, a simplified set of those, but I use those quite regularly, and it's amazing how often those sort of check out, and they're very good questions to ask. And so, as an example, I'm relatively new to NASA, but recently this year we were looking at launching a new technical effort under one of our projects within the Aeronautics Research Mission Directorate. We have a portfolio of projects. Some are finite duration, but some are very long-term, ongoing research projects. But within those research projects, we stand up technical efforts where we start and we stop them so that we can learn and then adjust our research portfolios as we go and spin off results as we go. And we were looking at standing up one of these new technical efforts, and the team came in and conducted a toll brief review with me and some of our other leaders. And as they were going through it, they were really struggling. They were looking at community noise from novel urban air mobility type of aircraft, and how would you develop and predict the community noise impact. And as they were looking at this, they want to develop a modeling tool that allows you to predict that, and then they set a goal of reducing the noise impact and the noise footprint from these aircraft. And so we were going through this toll gate, and they got to the point where they were saying, here's how we're going to measure our progress. And it really wasn't there. And they were struggling with it, and they said they were struggling with it, which was fantastic that they did. But as they were looking at it, they were trying to understand, well, what's the right metric here? And we went back and forth, and you start asking some questions. Well, okay, you want to reduce it by X percent. Well, what's your baseline? Well, we don't really have a baseline yet because there's nothing ever been done like this before. Okay, well, if you don't have a baseline, how will you see success? How do you understand that you've achieved good enough? And what is good enough, since we don't know what a baseline is? Well, we don't really know. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, we had a great conversation and a great discussion. And the project manager for this project is just fantastic and really engaged deeply in this discussion. And we finally got to the point of, well, what exactly are you trying to do? Which is question number one of the Heilmeyer criteria, or the catechism. What are you trying to do? And the answer is, well, we're trying to develop a tool that allows us to model this. Okay. What does your success metric, the 50% reduction or the percent reduction, have to do with developing the tool? Well, it doesn't. Okay, so maybe right. And so we went back and they took back and went back into formulation for a couple more months, and they came out the other end and came back for a revisit on the toll gate. And this time what they did is they looked at the tool development and said, we're going to cast our metrics and how we measure success and how we measure progress in terms of software and tool and methodology development metrics, and laid that out in terms of what kinds of things they need by when and how they're going to validate it in validation criteria. And all of a sudden we had a very well-formed technical effort. Now, we fully expect later on we'll use that tool. We may establish a baseline, and then we'll use that tool to drive down reductions, but we have to start by having a tool. And so that was a really, really good outcome, and actually the project came back and said, and this was a good exercise for us to go through this and think critically about what we're doing, because we feel like we have a much stronger project now and a much stronger basis to go forward. But asking these kinds of questions is sort of part of what you do. Before joining NASA, I was in industry, so just another quick example. And we had some real challenges. And this one gives you sort of a different take on the same set of asking good questions as being a good tool that you can use. Here's one where I was leading a program that was trying to build a large-scale demonstrator and a technology demonstrator. And we were out trying to get things from the supply base and parts are late, parts are struggling to come in. And this is a place where I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but, you know, the team lead who is putting all of this together is starting to put information in front of you, and you start poking at it, and you say, well, what does this mean? Well, this is the number of parts that we have in. Well, what percentage of parts do you have in? Do you know what your timeline is to get these parts? And we start evolving this conversation by asking questions to get to a good understanding of what our critical path was. And then we got into a conversation of, well, if we know what our critical path is and we know when other parts are starting to show up, we were actually able to rethink how we were going to build our big demonstrator. And it didn't solve world hunger, but we were able to pull in the schedule by a number of days, actually a couple of weeks, just by rearranging the build schedule to better correspond with when we were going to get delivery of the parts. And so that's another example, but here's one where instead of using it to get the team to do something, you use it to learn something and be effective as a leader in an area where you're not an expert. And so this tool is something that you can do for multiple purposes, if you will. And then there was another one where before I went to industry, I was actually in the government and the DoD for some time, and I was serving as an independent review panelist, reviewing another agency's project. And it was kind of a culture change for that agency, going from a research project to doing a sort of a technology development and demonstration project. And I started asking questions about risk. Well, how are you looking at risk management? What are your risks? Have you identified your risks? And it really hadn't. And it led to a good conversation and a good discussion, and that organization since then started to take on a very different stance toward risk management that was, you know, if they're doing just research projects, they don't do that, and that's fine. You know, risk, you manage your risk to the extent you can, but you understand in a research project that you're going to learn something and you're going to learn what you're going to learn, and you build on that. But that's a very different thing rather than trying to drive a schedule with a test and something else at the end, where you really need to manage your risk and understand what happens if parts don't arrive, if things aren't the quality you need, and things like that. And so it drove a very good conversation about risk management that drove some changes into how they look at those projects. So all these are different examples of how you can drive change, how you can learn something, and also how you can really kind of get to the heart of the matter and get a team to take ownership of something by asking questions as a really good management tool for program and project management. There are a few things that people can tend to get wrong when they do this. And of course, wrong is a relative term, but I think one of the most common is people will ask questions to get an answer and just get an answer. And those are really easy questions to answer. The trick is to ask more open-ended questions to get an explanation. Because then when you get to the explanation, you get the thought process, you get the basis behind the answer, and usually that's where, if there is a problem, that's where the problem is, or if there is something that's not quite right, that's what you can find. Or if you're trying to connect dots between things, that's where that information is. And so asking more open-ended questions is one thing that people tend to not do, because especially when you're dealing with a technical community like we have at NASA, because we're all technical people who want the answer, right? But the open-ended questions. Another one is taking the time to be patient and listen. A lot of times when we go into reviews especially, either we think we know the answer, or we have something we want to say, or we have an agenda that we want to get across. And sometimes if you jump in all of a sudden with the answer, or you start with the hard questions instead of letting the story develop a little bit, you do a couple of things. One is you may take it off track, and you may have gotten your question answered, but it's all in the storytelling, and you didn't let them tell the story. And the other is you can create a very closed environment where people aren't as open to talking as honestly and as openly as you would like them to be. Once people become defensive and clam up, it's not a good conversation anymore, and you may not get to the point that you want to get to. And so just being patient and listening and waiting until the right time to ask your question is just as important as asking the question. And then the last thing, there's a joke about the extroverted engineer who looks at the other person's shoes, right? Is thinking that maybe your question's dumb, especially if you're kind of to the story I told earlier. When I wasn't an expert in supply chain management, and I'm sitting here trying to figure out what's going on with my supply chain, assuming your question is dumb is not a good way to approach it, because your question probably isn't dumb. Even if it is a dumb question, it's because maybe you're working on something that you're not an expert in and you're learning it. Then it's not really dumb as much as just you're trying to learn. But people sometimes won't ask the question, and that's usually not very good either, because then you miss things. So I think those are kind of three common mistakes that people make when it comes to using this tool, the skill of asking good questions. This is one of those things that, you kind of start early and you hone over time. Of course, it's never too late to start, but I started really when I was a PhD student. One of the things you try to do as a PhD student is, as you're doing your research, you go off to conferences, you present your research, and of course, anytime you present your research in that setting, you get a lot of Q&A. And here you are on your feet figuring out how to answer technical questions about your work. Okay. Well, you probably know your work better than anybody else, but there's nothing that hones your thinking like answering questions on your feet. And I would observe other people doing the same thing, and some were really good at it and some were not. I would see the kinds of questions that were asked and how they got to clarity or not. And I really reflected on how, when I was asked these kinds of questions, what kind of questions sharpened my thinking and got me to think about how do I tell the story better. It really comes down to how you tell the story and clarity. I'll also sort of admit that one of the other things you do by asking good questions is clarify that story and sharpening that thinking, because even the story may be a great story, but if it's not communicated well, it's misunderstood. And my advisor when I was a PhD student, we were struggling with a couple of things that we saw out there, and one researcher in particular, and you never could get it. And I told him what an idiot I felt like because I never understood it. And he said, "No, Jimmy, you got it." He said, but one thing you should always bear in mind: a lack of clear communication, a lack of clear speaking often belies a lack of clear thinking. As I grew to deepen that and appreciate that, I really appreciated how questions become a really good tool as you sharpen your thinking, as you sharpen your delivery, and think through these questions and respond to questions. And then I saw something, and everybody's seen this, where, just like we're doing right here, a good part of leadership is being able to ask good questions. And instead of telling people, why don't you ask them and let them come to the answer? And I said, and I connected those dots. I connected those dots from, well, gee, every time somebody's asked me a question, it has helped me to be better. So maybe I can do the same thing. And I went back thinking about the kinds of questions that I was asked, and I started doing the same thing. But then it's just a matter of you got to practice. It's not something that you can invent overnight. Not every question you ask is going to be understood initially, and you just practice over and over and over again. And I still practice over and over and over again. And all these things, like the bad habits, there are times I walk into a meeting and I immediately jump in, and I always regret it, and I learn from it, but we all do it. It's just something that you have to continue to learn, practice, and hone, and the only way you do that is by actually doing it. I would say the biggest thing is go for it. You have the fundamentals. The fundamentals don't change. You know, it's like when I learned physics, F equals ma, and you can't push on a rope, right? The fundamentals don't change. They get a lot more complicated. There's a lot more moving parts, but fundamentals are fundamentals. The difference is really a shift in emphasis, because you go from doing the work, laying it out, and doing the planning to leading a team who is doing that and providing them guidance and leadership, and then helping to drive the resources and everything that they need to be successful. Then as part of your leadership role, though, you're still charged with overseeing what they're doing, and it comes down to the fundamentals. You can look at and see, are they following the fundamentals? And you can coach and guide them to follow the fundamentals to be successful just like you are. And so that's the real shift in emphasis going from project management to program management, is a shift from doing to leading, and that shift in emphasis, although still rests basically in the fundamentals. Then I guess the last thing I would say is, and by the way, don't ever be afraid to ask good questions. That becomes even more important when you get into that leadership role, because now all those questions your program manager has been asking you, it's your turn to start asking those questions, and use those as a way to guide and lead your team to do it. And then as you're doing this, though, don't ever stop learning. Spend time learning about leadership. Spend time learning about how to ask better questions. Spend better time learning how to hone and refine your skills and their skills, so that they can keep getting better, because the better they get, the better you get.